Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 7 of Great Decisions 2021 with Manitowoc Public Library. Hard to believe that we're in week 7 already. Before we get going with what I have no doubt is going to be an absolutely incredible lecture this evening, no pressure, but just wanted to thank our sponsors because without them, we would certainly not be able to present the full 8-week Great Decisions experience that we have. So I would like to thank the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So thank you very much to all our sponsors. Before we get started, and I give the introduction of tonight's speaker, I needed to make a couple of announcements. To everyone following along, just remember, if you have any questions or comments about what Professor Fields is talking about this evening, just type them into the comments section on either Facebook or YouTube, and we will get to those questions and comments following the lecture. Just a reminder that there are only 6 copies left at the library of the companion publication for Great Decisions 2021, and those are available at $15 a piece, which honestly is an incredible deal compared to if you bought it through the website or bought it as an e-reader. $15 cash or check. You can pick them up in the library at the front service desk, or you can just use curbside service and have them bring it out to your car. So $15 cash and check, preferably exact change if you're paying in cash. Also, as much as we love our sponsors, and we dearly do love our sponsors, it would be great if Great Decisions could be a self-sustaining program. So if you are so inclined to donate to the Great Decisions Legacy Fund, or if you would just like a copy of the pamphlet that normally you could get in room, just head to www.manitowoclibrary.org/great-decisions. You can download all of the information on the Legacy Fund, next week's speaker, as that's the only one left on the pamphlet. But just head to that URL and you can get all that there. Just a couple of mentions for programming that we have coming up. I mentioned curbside service already. And just so you know, even though the library is open again to the public, you can still utilize curbside service. And I found out just today that even once the pandemic has passed, we're still going to keep curbside service going. So if the weather's bad, like it's starting to turn now, or you just don't want to run out of the car to pick up a couple of books that you've put on hold, just utilize curbside service. That's going to remain in place even after COVID is a distant memory. Also, 2 programs to mention to you. Coming up this Thursday, March 18th at 6:30 p.m., a program called Foraging Your Lawn by Julia Lee. She's going to be talking about medicinal and edible weeds that you just have growing in your yard. It has the best slogan of any program that I've encountered in a long time. If you can't beat them, eat them. And so tune in this Thursday for that. And then also I just wanted to mention that running now from today through April 15th, we're holding an awful art contest through Manitowoc Public Library. The pressure to create wonderful art is completely off. Think of it as the artistic creation equivalent of watching Sharknado or Plan 9 from outer space. Just have some fun. 3 categories: family, teen, and adult. Submit it through Facebook. There's through an email address that you'll find on our website, and the best worst art will be richly rewarded for their efforts. So that's coming up, running through the 15th. So now to this evening's festivities. If I could introduce our speaker tonight, David Fields is the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in U.S.-Korean relations. He is the author of Foreign Friends, Syngman Rhee, American Exceptionalism and the Division of Korea, and the editor of The Diary of Syngman Rhee, 1904 to 1934, 1944, published by the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History. Since 2015, he has been the book review editor of the Journal of American East Asian Relations. He has been published in the Washington Post, North Korea Review, Journal of American East Asian Relations, SinoNK.com, Transaction of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea Branch, and in the working paper series of the Cold War International History Project. His research and analysis has been featured on National Public Radio, Wisconsin Public Radio, C-SPAN, and CNN. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Professor David Fields presenting the Korean Peninsula. Professor Fields?
Thank you so much, Tim, for that kind introduction. And really, thank you to all of you who make this possible, this Great Decision series. It's really a wonderful series that I've been honored to be a part of at a few institutions now. And I'm really grateful for this invitation because this, after all, is Wisconsin, and I'm at the University of Wisconsin. And at Wisconsin, we believe in this thing called the Wisconsin idea. The idea that the research that goes on at the university, that the expertise at the university shouldn't just stay at the university itself, that it should be used and it should go out around the state. But at the heart of the Wisconsin idea is a collaboration. And the Wisconsin idea only works when the university and the community come together. So it's not something that we at the university can just do alone. You know, we have to have partners. We have to have collaborators to make this happen. And that's why I'm always so excited when I get invited to speak at a library, at some civic association in Wisconsin, because this is an opportunity for me to put the idea, the Wisconsin idea, into practice. This is an opportunity for us to put the Wisconsin idea into practice. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight about an issue that I care very deeply about, that I've spent the better half of the last decade and a half studying. And frankly, the people around me, especially my wife, are sick and tired of hearing about it. So I'm always glad to have a new audience to present to. So I'm going to talk tonight about what does the future hold for the U.S. relationship with the ROK. But I'm probably going to spend about a third to a half of the time tonight talking about the past, because I am, after all, a historian of the U.S.-Korean relationship. I am someone who lives and research and writes about the past. And so I'm going to talk a fair deal tonight about the past, but the past is very important to understanding where the U.S.-ROK relationship is right now, and what are some of the possibilities for where it might go in the future. And this is why it's so important to study history. And as a historian, I really believe that. We study history not because history tells us what the present will be or what the future will be. I am not one of those historians who believe that history repeats itself. However, we study history because history shapes the present. And if you can understand the past of a relationship, you can understand something about its present, and you can also understand the possible futures that might be out there. Okay, if you can understand the fault lines in U.S.-Korean relations, you can also understand where this relationship is likely to break up, along which fault lines is it likely to break up in the future. If you can understand the strong points of the U.S.-Korean relations, you can understand why we might have good relations between the U.S. and the Korean Peninsula for a very long time to come. So I'm going to organize my talk tonight around three tensions in the U.S.-Korean relations. And Tim, if you can advance to the next slide here. There are tensions over history. There are tensions over the relationship between there are tensions over policy over North Korea. What policies would the ROK prefer to pursue? What policies does the United States prefer to pursue? And then there are tensions within the ROK-US alliance, okay? Tensions over the future, over strategy, over weapon system, over cost sharing, okay? So I'm gonna go over the historical tensions, the tensions related to North Korea, and the tensions related to the alliance. And what I'm hoping to do tonight is give you a little bit of context for this relationship. So hopefully in the next few weeks, in the next few months, when you read news about the Korean Peninsula, which you almost certainly will. I mean, this is an issue that is not going away anytime. that you'll have a better context for maybe understanding some of this news, that you can place it in a historical context of U.S.-Korean relations and place it in these tensions over policy on these issues. All right, so that's what I'm going to try to do tonight. So the first tension is the tension over history. And Tim, if you could go to the next slide. I'm going to spend the first third of my talk talking about history. I'm going to go over this history quite quickly, okay, very briefly. But if anything I say sounds interesting to you, almost all of which, except for the last historical tension that I'm going to talk about tonight, you can get in incredible detail in my book, Foreign Friends, Sigmund Rhee, American Exceptionalism, and the Division of Korea. So if you're interested in what I have to say, I encourage you to go out and find the book. Perhaps your library has a copy of the book. And if you want more details, you can find them here. All right. Tim, if you could go to the next slide. However, I understand a 300-page book on U.S.-Korean relations is not everybody's cup of tea. It probably is for some of you, but probably a lot of you would prefer something much more succinct. So if the history portion of this talk interests you, you can also see this talk that I gave on Wisconsin Public Television last December. And this will only be the history portion of the talk I'm giving tonight, but I go into it in much greater detail. So if the history of U.S.-ROK relations is something that's of interest to you, I wanted to give you these two resources of where you can go to get some more. Okay, Tim, if you could go to the next slide then. All right, so the first part of my talk is the tensions over history in the U.S.-ROK alliance. And I'm choosing 4 historical moments and phenomena to emphasize some of the tensions that exist. It's a strong alliance, but it's not without its tensions. And the first point that I want to make is you have to understand that U.S.-Korean relations does not start in June of 1950 when the U.S. intervenes to save the Republic of Korea during the Korean War. Okay, it does not start there. It does not even start in August of 1945 when the United States suggests the joint occupation of the Korean Peninsula to the Soviet Union. All right, U.S.-Korean relations starts all the way back in 1882 when the United States signs a treaty of peace, amity, commerce, and navigation with what is then known as the Kingdom of Chosun, okay, named after the last dynasty of the traditional Korean monarchy. All right, this is so important to understand because if you believe that U.S.-Korean relations starts in 1950 or 1945, not only do you have an inaccurate view of U.S.-Korean relations, but you will never be able to understand the Korean view of U.S.-Korean relations because unlike Americans, every Korean knows that U.S.-Korean relations begins in 1882. It does not begin in 1950 or 1945. So in 1882, the U.S. and the Kingdom of Chosun sign this treaty. And the first clause of this treaty contains the following, or the first article of this treaty is as follows. It says, if other powers deal unjustly or oppressively with either government, the other will exert their good offices on being informed of the case to bring about an amicable arrangement, thus showing their friendly feelings. Okay, that is the first clause of the treaty. Now, what does that mean? It is very much 19th century legalese. But the thing that you need to focus on is the phrase good offices. Okay, and now good offices was a technical legal term in the late 19th century, which referred to mediation. And what that clause meant was that if the Kingdom of Chosun got into difficulty with another power, perhaps a neighbor, that they could then ask the United States to extend their good offices and mediate that dispute, okay? But it's a technical legal term. And what this means is that if the United States, it's obligated to extend its good offices, but if both parties do not accept them, then the United States is not obligated to go any further. Okay, so this good offices clause meant that the United States was obligated to at least extend an offer of mediation at the request of the Korean government, should it get into any problems, but it was not required to do anything more. Now, the problem with this treaty is when it was translated into Korean is there is no equivalent terms to good offices in Korean. In fact, there's no even equivalent concept in East Asian jurisprudence at the time to translate good offices. And so instead of good offices, they just translated the treaty must help. Okay, the United States must help should Korea come into some difficulty with one of its neighbors. And this would become very consequential in 1904 when Korea would have very serious difficulties with one of its neighbors. And it's in 1904 that the Japanese occupy Korea during the Russo-Japanese War and then refused to leave and began a 40-year colonization of the Korean Peninsula, okay? And this is very important to understanding the history of U.S.-Korean relations and Korean-Japanese relations. Korea is a colony of Japan from about 1904 to 1945 after the war. And so what happens is in 1904 and 1905, the Kingdom of Chosun repeatedly sends envoys to the United States asking President Theodore Roosevelt to intervene in the situation, okay, to try to help Korea out now that it's being colonized by the Japanese. And Theodore Roosevelt refuses to do so, okay? Not only does he refuse to intervene, but he also refuses to even acknowledge the Korean request. He refuses to even offer the good offices of the United States. And when he does that, he technically violates the 1882 Korean-American Treaty, okay? And the Koreans remember this. And for this reason, many Koreans see the United States as complicit in what is one of the worst disasters of the 20th century for Korea, which is its colonization by Japan. Now, whenever I encounter Koreans who hold this point of view, I always try to push back a little bit and say, you understand that even if Theodore Roosevelt would have offered to mediate this dispute between Korea and Japan, once the Japanese refused, as they certainly would have, the colonization of Korea would have moved forward anyway, okay? And I believe that that is an indisputable fact, but that doesn't change the fact that many Koreans view the United States as having violated this foundational treaty of U.S.-Korean relations in 1904 and 1905 when the United States stands by and does not come to their aid in any way, even offer sympathy when Korea is colonized by Japan. Okay, so that's the first historical tension. The second one is much better known, and that is the division of Korea in 1945. All right, and it's important to understand that even though the division of Korea is often described as a compromise between the United States and the Soviet Union, it isn't. Okay, the division of Korea is very much an American idea. The United States suggests a joint occupation of Korea to the Soviet Union at the 38th parallel, and the Soviet Union accepts that. Okay, there is no negotiation. It is an American suggestion. And the reason the United States suggests this is because in Cairo in 1943, in what's called the Cairo Declaration, the United States pledges itself to restore Korean independence in due course after the war is over. And as the war is ending in 1945 and they see what the Soviet Union is doing in places like Poland and their half of Germany, they get very worried that the Soviet Union is actually serious about that. Okay. And so they want boots on the ground in Korea to make sure that the Soviet Union is going to make good on its pledge. The Soviet Union has also agreed to the Cairo Declaration to make Korea independent in the future. It's so important to understand, though, that this division was never supposed to be permanent. In fact, from their perspective, it was never even a division. It was just a joint occupation of the Korean Peninsula while they were trying to establish a Korean provisional government, because Korea had been a Japanese colony. It did not have a government of its own. So this division was never supposed to be permanent. If Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel would have known that Korea was still going to be divided 75 years later after they drew that line across Korea, they would be shocked today. And Tim, if you could go to the next slide, please. You can see the very small scale National Geographic map that they drew. This, I believe, is a reproduction, but this is the actual, a different version of the map they would have used to just draw a line across the Korean Peninsula. It was never supposed to be permanent, but the Koreans recognized that this was an American idea, okay? And that the United States is very much responsible for this joint occupation, and in many ways, therefore, is responsible for the division of Korea. Now, I believe that there's plenty of responsibility to go around, that the Soviet Union also bears much of the responsibility, and the Koreans themselves do as well. But there's no doubt who had the idea in the first place, and it was an American idea, okay? If we go to the next slide, Tim, the third tension is the American withdrawal from the ROK in 1949. Okay. Another myth that I find that I have to deal with quite frequently when I'm lecturing on Korea is the idea that the United States has been in Korea, that we occupied Korea in 1945, and we've been there ever since. Okay. This is absolutely untrue. American military leaders were unhappy with the division of Korea from the beginning, and they were looking for a way out as soon as they got there. Okay, the decision to suggest the joint occupation of Korea was very much suggested by American political leaders, not American military leaders. The United States military did not like the idea of occupying Korea. They believed it was of no strategic value to the United States, and they had no plan to occupy Korea, which is one of the reasons why the occupation of Korea starts off very badly and goes from bad to worse. So American military leaders are looking for a way out from the very beginning, since they arrived in 1945. And after the Republic of Korea is created through UN-observed elections in 1948, the United States military decides that they're going to withdraw from Korea as soon as possible. And they withdraw in July of 1949. And they do so over the strenuous objections of the Republic of Korea government, the South Korean government, which at that time is headed by Syngman Rhee. They do so over the strenuous objections of Syngman Rhee, and they also do so over the advice of the CIA. And you can see in the image here a CIA report from February 1949 on the consequences of U.S. troop withdrawal from Korea. Okay, and Syngman Rhee and the CIA largely agreed with this, believed that if the United States withdrew, the North Koreans were going to invade Korea. Now, American military leaders did not believe that this was likely, and they advocated for a withdrawal anyway, which happened. As the Americans were withdrawing, Syngman Rhee and other officials in the ROK government begged for security guarantees from the United States that they would defend the ROK in the case of an invasion. And those guarantees were never forthcoming. Okay. And as you all know, it turns out that Syngman Rhee and the CIA analysts were right, and the North Koreans did invade in June of 1950, and the United States had to rush back to the Korean Peninsula and ended up saving the ROK, but fighting a very, very vicious, a very protracted 3-year war on the Korean Peninsula. And understanding the 1949 withdrawal is so key to understanding the psychology of U.S.-Korean relations, because why South Koreans really value the U.S. alliance, and they really value the American intervention in the Korean War. In fact, the ROK would not exist today if it hadn't been for that intervention. They also understand that if the United States hadn't withdrawn from Korea in 1949, the ROK never would have needed saving in the first place. Okay, this is a cause of fundamental tension in the alliance. They're glad that the United States intervened to save them, but they also acknowledge that if the United States hadn't left in the first place, they wouldn't have had this truly terrible and awful war. So as you can see from these first 3 examples, for many Koreans, the United States was complicit in the 3 great tragedies of the 20th century for Korea: the colonization by Japan, the division of their country, and then the Korean War. All right, and I'll just talk about one more tension before I get into the more current stuff. If you could go to the next slide, Tim. And this is tension over American support for anti-communist dictators in the ROK. And you can see here at the center of your screen, this is a Korean dictator named Park Chung-hee. And you can see him being entertained in the White House by JFK. I just happened to choose JFK. I could have shown Reagan with Chun Doo-hwan. I could have shown any number of American presidents entertaining South Korean dictators. All right, South Korea from about 1965 till 1988 would be ruled by military dictators. And the legacy of South Korea's dictators is actually, it's a complicated one, because on the one hand, they really did bring a lot of economic development to the ROK, but this economic development went hand in hand with serious and at times brutal political repression for Koreans who wanted to see a return to democracy, for Koreans who wanted liberal rights. And there are many Koreans, particularly on the left of the political spectrum in Korea today, who are very critical of the United States for its relationship with these dictators, who believe that the United States should have done more to promote democracy in Korea, and that Korea might have been able to democratize sooner, that these military dictatorships did not need to go on for 30 years, okay? And this is another cause of tensions in the alliance. Now, there's many American policymakers who were active at that time who actually feel like the United States did a lot to support the Korean democracy movement, but this is a cause of tension. There is not agreement over this. All right. So now this concludes the historical part of my talk, but you can see that there are tensions built into the relationship where especially South Koreans wonder if the United States is a reliable ally, if they can count on the United States to abide by its treaty obligations, if they can count on the United States to make good decisions in relation to the Korean Peninsula. All right, Tim, if you could go ahead to the next slide, and we'll move on to the second big point I want to talk about, which is tensions over North Korea. Okay, and the image that you see here it's actually a very, very powerful and very emotional images for Koreans. And this is of a joint North-South Korean Olympic team marching into the stadium at the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018, so about 3 years ago. And you can see they're marching in all white, no colors, and they're marching under a united Korean flag, okay, a white flag with a blue Korean Peninsula on it. All right. And this image, I feel like, captures very well a real tension in the U.S.-Korean relations, and that is how the different countries view North Korea. Okay. Do they view North Korea as a security threat, or do they view the existence of North Korea as a national tragedy? Okay, for the United States, North Korea is very much a security threat. It is a problem that needs to be solved. For South Koreans, North Korea it's a threat, but it's a national tragedy. Okay, it's the result of a tragedy that was not of Korea's own making. Okay, Tim, if you could go to the next slide then. And I'll just highlight some of the differences that these two lenses for seeing North Korea, how it results in different views from the ROK and the United States. And that is that South Koreans do not primarily see North Korea as a threat. Okay, they primarily view the North Koreans as ethnic kin. Okay, and they understand that they're dangerous. Okay, but this is primarily how they view it. And they view North Korea's very existence as a result of a national tragedy that was not of their own making, and that was the division of Korea in 1945. And we've already covered whose idea that was. All right. And I like to try to explain this to particularly Wisconsin audiences, to try to explain the Korean psychology related to division as imagine if tomorrow the state of Wisconsin was divided right down the middle by the I-39, the inner I-39, that was the corridor. And that for the next 70 years, West Wisconsin and East Wisconsin were technically enemies. Okay, and I'm from La Crosse, so I'm a West Wisconsinner. And you hear for 70 years that the people in the East, the people in Manitowoc and Green Bay, are dangerous, that they're homicidal, that they're planning our destruction. And there's plenty of evidence actually to indicate that that's true. And you know at a certain level that that's true. But then you also know that actually my uncle lives in Green Bay. And I have a bunch of cousins in Manitowoc, and we used to get together and have good times. And we share a lot of things in common. We still love cheese curds. Okay, we're still all cheeseheads. We still love to root for the Green Bay Packers. Okay, we still like ice fishing. We still like to complain about mosquitoes. All right, so there's this sense on the one hand that you're living in a dangerous environment, but there's a sense on the other hand that you share a kinship, you share a common identity with these people. And that is something that happens in South Korea. The South Koreans do not primarily view North Korea as a security threat. They view them as their own ethnic kin. And it's very hard for Americans to understand this. And it means that South Korea prefers different policies in dealing with North Korea than the United States does. And in fact, many South Koreans, at least ostensibly, fear Japan much more than they fear North Korea because of the history of Japanese colonization. And this, finally, the final thing I'll say about this is it leads to a sense of fatalism about North Korea in South Korea. And nothing captures this than if you're living in South Korea, like I have for many years, and there's a missile test in North Korea, and it'll be all over the international news. I'll get people emailing me, asking me if I'm okay. And I will respond to them by taking a picture of the front page of a Korean newspaper, which will be about the latest K-pop star to have plastic surgery go wrong, or the latest scandal, among this actress or something like that. They know that the North Koreans are dangerous, but they've had to live with the threat for so long in some sense, they have become fatalistic about it. All right. So that's there's the different lenses for viewing North Korea. If you could go to the next slide, Tim. However, within South Korea itself, there are different political camps, and these different camps have different conceptions of the North Korea issue. So Korea, like the United States, has a more or less a two-party system. It's slightly more complicated than that, but that's basically what it is. You have Korean conservatives and you have Korean progressives or liberals. Now, I hate those two terms because, in fact, those two terms mean nothing at all in Korea what they mean in the United States. They mean totally different things. And if I can just go out on a limb, I would say the difference between conservatives and liberals in the United States is, one, what do you think the role of government in society should be? Do you want a big government or do you want a small government? And then two, what is your position on the contentious social issues of our day? Okay, that is not what conservative and progressive mean in Korea. Okay, the divide in Korean politics is about policy towards North Korea and the relationship with the United States. Okay, so if you're a conservative in the Korean political spectrum, what that means is you favor a close relationship with the United States, and you are skeptical about engagement with North Korea. Okay, you want a close relationship with the United States, and you're skeptical about North Korea. There are no Korean hawks on North Korea. Okay, both conservatives and progressives prefer engagement policies with North Korea, but the conservatives say North Korea has to go first. Okay, when North Korea starts showing signs that it's willing to change, we should help them as much as we can. Okay, we should give them economic aid, we should give them assistance, but the North Koreans have to change first, and we want to stay close to the United States. If you're a progressive in the Korean political spectrum, that means you prefer a warmer policy with North Korea, and you're slightly skeptical of your relationship with the United States. Okay, you would like to move forward on inter-Korean relations. You would like to move forward with economic and political dialogue with no preconditions. All right, and you're worried about the United States holding inter-Korean relationships back. Those are the main divides between conservatives and progressives in South Korean politics. And a perfect example of Korean progressive policy towards the ROK is what was known as the Sunshine Policy. And that was a policy of the progressive administration of Kim Dae-jung between about 1997 and 2002, 2003. And this policy was named after the Aesop fable. And if you're unfamiliar with the fable, the North Wind and the Sun get together and they decide to have a contest about who can make this farmer take his jacket off. And so the North Wind blows and blows at the farmer, and the colder he gets, the more he grips his jacket and kind of bears down on it. And the Sun says, I'm going to take a different approach. And the sun shines on him, and he gets so warm and comfortable that he takes his jacket off. All right. This was the idea behind the Sunshine Policy of Kim Dae-jung, that if we take the first steps towards North Korea, if we give them economic aid, if we try to assuage what they say are their security concerns, maybe we can have some progress on the Korean Peninsula. Now, I am skeptical that policy was really very successful, and so are Korean conservatives. But for Korean progressives, it was unsuccessful because while they were trying to pursue engagement, the George W. Bush administration was labeling North Korea, as a part of the axis of evil. Okay, and so it was really the United States that torpedoed the Sunshine Policy. If you can go to the next slide, please, Tim. And so what we have in Korea right now is oh, I'm sorry, go one slide back, Tim. What we have in Korea right now is we have a progressive administration under the president Moon Jae-in, okay, who's from the Progressive Party. And he is pursuing what is somewhat derogatorily called the Moonshine Policy, okay, because his name is Moon, and because what he is trying to do is very much similar to the Sunshine Policy. And that shouldn't be any surprise because he was one of the chief architects of the Sunshine Policy under Kim Dae-jung in the 1990s. And what Moon Jae-in is hoping for is enhanced dialogue between the ROK, the DPRK, and the US. He has also been hoping to facilitate some sort of sanctions relief for North Korea, okay, in return for reductions in its nuclear capacity. And barring that, he's been looking for what he calls an ethnic exception to the sanction regimes against North Korea, okay? So let everybody else keep the sanctions in place. but give South Korea an exemption, an ethnic exemption, since we're all Koreans, and let us work on this separate track of engagement with the DPRK. Let us restart economic engagement with the DPRK. So Moon Jae-in was terrified by the fire and fury phase of the Trump rhetoric, of the Trump policy towards Korea, but he was very much a fan of the symmetry phase. All right. So one of the tensions in the U.S.-Korean relationship right now is Moon Jae-in really wanting to improve inter-Korean relations through some sort of sanctions relief, and a Trump administration not allowing him to do that, and a Biden administration who is still probably trying to find their feet on a North Korea policy, but is probably unlikely to grant such an exemption too. Okay. So, but I think you can see that regardless of whether it's a conservative administration or a progressive administration in power in the ROK, there are tensions between the United States and the ROK because we fundamentally view North Korea through different lenses. For the United States, we see North Korea as a security threat. Okay. For the South Koreans, they see North Korea as a result of a national tragedy, and they almost see North Korea as a state that's more to be pitied almost than to be feared. All right. If you could go to the next slide now, Tim. And now we'll move into the last point I want to make, the last tension I want to examine. And that tension is over the nature of the ROK alliance itself. Okay. And the picture that you're seeing here, you'll notice the woman in yellow, that her name is Park Geun-hye. She is the former president of the Republic of Korea before Moon Jae-in. And you can see her on a reviewing stand with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And this photo was taken at a military parade in Beijing that was being held to commemorate the defeat of the Japanese in World War II. But it was a very jarring image for Americans to view, where you see one of your chief allies, one of your treaty allies in East Asia, sitting in a reviewing stand with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And I feel like this image really highlights some of the tensions in the U.S. ROK alliance, all right, that I'm going to talk about now. So Tim, if you could go to the next slide. The first tension I want to talk about is the tensions over special measures agreements, or SMAs. And these are the nuts and bolts agreement that actually determines who is going to pay what. Who is going to pay what costs for this alliance. These are cost-sharing agreements. And the picture that I've included here is a picture of the U.S. garrison Camp Humphreys, which is just newly reconstructed in Pyeongtaek, South Korea. And it is the largest overseas American military installation in the world right now. Okay, and it's basically brand new. And almost all forces on the Korean Peninsula have been reconcentrated into this super base, Camp Humphreys. And this base costs a lot of money. And so one of the tensions in the alliance is who is going to pay for what. Now, prior to the Trump administration, these cost-sharing agreements, there was some contention in them, but they generally were settled behind closed doors, and they were settled amicably with all sides. And the American philosophy going into these cost-sharing agreements was the United States has the amount of troops we have in our army because that's the number that we think we need. And we have to base these troops somewhere. Either we can base them in the United States or we base them abroad. And the philosophy in these cost-sharing measurements was the host nation should pay the costs of these troops beyond what it would cost to base them in the United States, okay? Because we're going to have them regardless of where they are. All right, so the South Koreans never paid, in essence, the full cost of stationing these troops, but this was the philosophy behind it. They would pay the extra that it would cost to have them there. All right. Now, the Trump administration went into these SMA agreements with a totally different philosophy. Okay. Oh, and I should say that these SMAs generally run for 5 years. And the average over the last 30 or 40 years was the ROK would increase its contribution by 8.5% every SMA to keep up with inflation. Well, the Trump administration went into its SMA negotiations demanding a 400% increase, okay? Demanding that the payment go from about $1 billion a year to about $5 billion a year. And this was very, very insulting for the Koreans. And it would be insulting to anybody, but it was especially insulting when you consider the historical tensions that exist in the relationship, okay? The Korean worries about this alliance, the Korean frustration over historical examples of the United States not being a good ally to the Korean Peninsula. And the Trump administration, if they knew that at all, seemed to just want to rub salt into this wound. And what happened was the Koreans refused to sign an SMA under those terms. So for the last 2 years, the United States and Korea had no SMA. They had no cost-sharing agreement. And what this meant was deferred maintenance on many American facilities. And it also meant many Koreans who are employed by U.S. Forces Korea losing their jobs and being furloughed. And it really has done a lot to degrade the readiness. I mean, the commanders will tell you that it's not making a difference, that they're still ready, but things have not been as smooth as they should for the last 2 years because of the Trump administration's negotiating position. Now, in fact, just last week, the Korean Foreign Ministry announced that the ROK and the Biden administration have agreed in principle to a new cost-sharing agreement that will cover the next 5 years. There's no details in this agreement yet, but I would imagine when it comes out, you'll find that Korea probably accepted a small increase, 5%, 8.5%. And it looks in many ways like a return to normal in U.S.-Korean relations, a return to the previous philosophy regarding the SMAs. However, I think a real test of where we are on this SMA issue will be when the American presidency switches back to the Republican Party. Because now that these cost-sharing measures have been politicized, it'll be very interesting to see whether a Republican administration will choose to politicize them again in the future, or whether we're back kind of more to where we've been in the alliance for the previous 30 or 40 years. So it's a very important issue to watch. All right, Tim, if you could go to the next slide. Another tension in a relationship is tensions over the THAAD missile batteries. But really what this is it's tension over modernization in the alliance, okay? So THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Anti-Missile Defense System, okay? This is the United States' most cutting-edge anti-missile system, and it was installed in South Korea to defend that base I just showed you, Camp Humphreys, from North Korean intercontinental ballistic missiles, okay? And the United States felt that this was necessary now that they are reconcentrating their troops, and also as North Korea is becoming more capable in terms of its missiles. Now, the Chinese were very, very adamant that the South Koreans not accept this new missile system. They believed that this was actually aimed at them, that this THAAD battery on the ROK would give the United States capabilities of electronic espionage into China that it didn't have previously. But the ROK accepted the THAAD battery over American pressure, and the Chinese retaliated with severe economic, I won't call them sanctions because they weren't sanctions, but what they did is they cut off all Chinese tourism to the ROK for several months. And I was actually living in Korea when this happened. And it was a big hit to the Korean economy, especially to the people who worked in tourism, all right? And this was especially unpopular for many Koreans, many Korean progressives who are already skeptical of the U.S. relationship, because the THAAD missile battery does not cover Seoul. The way it was installed is it covers Camp Humphreys and other American installations, but it does not cover Seoul. So for many Koreans, the Korean economy was taking a hit for a missile system that did nothing to enhance the security of Seoul, which is where about 50% of the Korean population lives. So Koreans were paying the price for greater security at Camp Humphreys, all right? And they were not happy about that. They did not think accepting THAAD was the right thing to do. But the whole conflict over THAAD really drew attention to what is going to be an ongoing problem in the alliance. And that is China going to object and retaliate every time a piece of military equipment in the alliance gets upgraded? All right. Is it going to be possible to continue modernizing, to continue having the ROK Army and the U.S. Army using the same type of equipment without alienating the Japanese? And at what point, the Chinese, at what point will pressure from China on North Korea become too great? Okay. At what point will it really get uncomfortable for the ROK? All right, Tim, if you could go to the next slide. And this segues right into the next slide, which is really tensions over the future of the alliance itself, okay? And that is that the ROK has a real problem. And that is its main security partner, the United States, is 6,000 miles away, while its main economic partner, China, is just a few hundred miles away. Oh, and by the way, its main security partner and its main economic partner are experiencing a deterioration of relations. And the outlook is not looking good for the US-China relationship. Okay. Where does this leave the Republic of Korea? Okay. How reliable are American security guarantees, and how do you possibly weigh them against the economic interests in China? Okay. Now, the last thing the Republic of Korea wants to do is the last thing they want is to be forced to make a choice between China and the United States. But it's looking ever more likely that at some point, either the Chinese or the Americans are going to object to their having special relationships with both parties. Okay. And at that point, the South Koreans have to be thinking about this. Okay. And they have to be thinking about, in the long term, the United States is always going to be 6,000 miles away, while the Chinese are always going to be next door. All right. And this is something that actually I think a lot of Americans appreciate. And the American solution for this is to try to make the ROK less dependent on the United States and to encourage further regional integration between the ROK, Japan, and the United States, and to really create a strong trilateral alliance in East Asia that will help Korea diversify a little bit. But the ROK is very much reluctant to do this for historical reasons, because the Japanese colonized Korea from 1905 to 1945. And there are many issues from that colonization, many historical issues that the Koreans believe the Japanese have not dealt with efficiently. So instead of Korea and Japan coming closer together, instead of a trilateral relationship in East Asia, you very much still have two bilateral relationships. You have the US-Japan relationship and the US-Korea relationship. All right, if you could go to the next slide, Tim. All right, so I've talked about the tensions. I've talked about the historical tensions. I've talked about how we don't see eye to eye on North Korea. I've talked about tensions in the structure of the alliance itself. And I just want to close on some reasons for optimism in the relationship. I feel like I've highlighted all the negative things, but I want to talk about some reasons for optimism. And I think the first reason for optimism is that U.S.-Korean relations have been here before. Okay, we have gone through difficult times before. If you could advance to the next slide, Tim. The image that I'm showing you here is an image from 2002. And what you're seeing is American flags being torn apart in front of City Hall in Seoul. Okay, in 2002, there was probably the greatest outbreak or anti-American protests in Korea in probably the 70-year history of the alliance. And it was sparked by the tragic death of two Korean schoolgirls who were run over by an American military vehicle on a rural highway in Korea. It was a terrible accident, but the outpouring of anti-Americanism that came out of that really fundamentally threatened the structure of the alliance for a few weeks. And for the first time, Koreans were telling pollsters, a majority of Koreans were telling pollsters that maybe it was time for U.S. forces to leave Korea. And as a historian, I feel like you can't see an outbreak of anti-Americanism like that and think it was about two schoolgirls, but it was really also about the fundamental historical tensions in this alliance and frustration over the 20th century the Koreans experienced, which they saw the United States as partially responsible for. So we've been in these dark times before. And what has happened is, even though there was all this pressure on the alliance from the Korean population, the Korean government and the American government got together and they decided that this alliance was worth too much. Okay, that this alliance was too valuable for both countries to let an incident like this torpedo it. And we're going to do whatever we need to do. We will say what we need to say. We will offer what sort of indemnities we need to get through this situation. Okay, and as I see it, the US-ROK alliance has three core constituencies. Okay, there's the Korean government, there's the American government, and then there's the Korean people. All right, I don't consider the American people a core constituency of the alliance, because I think most American people really do not care that much about the US-Korean alliance. I think many of them are not very well informed on it. And what has happened in these previous periods of tension is that when stress on the alliance came from one of these constituencies, say the Korean people in 2002, the American government and the Korean government got together and said, we are going to solve this problem. Now, in the last 4 years of Donald Trump, I actually think the US-Korean alliance has been under immense stress. okay? And it's come under stress from the American government or the American president. But what the Korean government did is they basically took the insults and said, no, we're not going to sign an SMA, but we're also not going to retaliate because this alliance is too important to us. And actually what you had in 2018 and 2019 is behind the scenes, you actually had many Republican congressmen pressuring the Trump administration to treat the Koreans better. And in fact, in the defense authorization acts of those 2 years, you actually had Republican congressmen inserting language into those bills saying that U.S. forces could not be withdrawn from Korea without the Secretary of Defense certifying that these withdrawals would in no way harm the U.S.-Korean alliance. Okay, so you kind of have the core constituencies closing to acknowledge that we're going through a difficult time right now, but this alliance is too important to let it be destroyed by a tragedy like the Yeongju Highway incident or a president like Donald Trump who is going to make unrealistic demands on this alliance. And the final thing that I will say is I think one of the real strengths of the U.S.-Korean alliance is actually that the U.S. and the ROK share a common vision of the world. Okay, Americans and Koreans, we're vastly different linguistically. We're vastly different culturally. We have vastly different outlooks about many things. But when we look at the world and when we look at international relations and international economy, we actually have a tremendous amount in common. We're both liberal democracies. We both generally believe in free trade and liberal economics. We believe in a rules-based international order, and we want to see a peaceful future. And so I think that our alliance has a tremendous amount in common. And even though we have these tensions built in, I expect the U.S.-Korean alliance to be stable and probably going strong for many decades to come. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. And I'd be delighted to attempt to answer whatever questions you might have on anything I've said or anything that you've seen about Korea that you might want to ask.
Thank you very much, Professor Fields, for that incredibly good lecture. I do have several questions that have come in already. Before I get to them, just a couple quick things. If anyone would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that they saw tonight so that you can see it more up close and get the title of the book and also the URL for the Wisconsin Public Television presentation that Professor Fields talked about, just email me at tgodzinski@manitowoc.org and I will send that out to you. The other thing is, if I mispronounce anything in any of these questions, please forgive me. It is not intentional, but I will do my best. So actually, I had a couple of questions that were emailed to me before, but if anyone has questions and comments, please just type them into the comments field on either Facebook or YouTube. But the first question that I was asked, and I will put things up that I can, but I can't type this one in, is what triggered the Bodo League killings in Gangwon-do and the Jeju Island uprising?
Oh boy. This is so how to answer this question. So first of all, the Bodo League massacre is one of the most horrific massacres during the Korean War. And if you're not familiar with the Korean War is an incredibly brutal conflict. And it's full of atrocities on all sides. And I think if you read primarily American sources, of course, we focus on the North Korean atrocities, the shooting of American prisoners of war, the mass execution of members of the Rhee government, of Korean police when the North Koreans were occupying South Korea. And those massacres were real. What's come out since the 1990s and since Korea has become a more liberal democracy is the fact that the ROK actually also committed mass atrocities. Now, did they kill as many people as the North Koreans? It's really hard to say. And in some sense, it doesn't matter, but we're talking tens of thousands of people, okay? Not thousands of people. We're talking about tens of thousands of civilians who are massacred by the ROK government. And one of the largest massacres was the Bodo League massacre. And the Bodo League is a really interesting thing. And it's after the Republic of Korea is created in 1948, there were many communists who were living in the Southern Zone. And so the government actually offered them an amnesty and said, if you come forward and admit you're a communist, we'll give you re-education, we'll give you job training, and you can essentially be reintroduced in society on terms of equality. And you'll be placed in what's called the Bodo League, which is the League for Protection. All right. Now, what the ROK government was actually doing was it was building a massive database of former communists who might be unreliable in the case of a war with North Korea. And one of the things that happened when the war broke out is the ROK government started attempting to kill everyone who was on the Bodo League, because they were operating under the principle that if you had been a communist before, you might be a communist again. All right. So this is really one of the truly terrible massacres of the Korean War. Now, and it's also perpetuated by the man my book is about, is Syngman Rhee. And so I'm writing another book on him right now, and it's an issue that I'm going to have to deal with in this book. And the question is, did he order this or not? And I haven't found evidence that he ordered it, but at the same time, he's absolutely responsible for it. Because when you're the president of a country and your armed forces massacre tens of thousands of people, you're responsible for it. All right, there's no doubt about that. There also seems to be very little doubt that he believed, and that many around him believed, that this was absolutely necessary at the time. That the extermination of communists was essential to the survival of the ROK and essential to winning the Korean War. I happen to think that they were wrong about that. I happen to think that actually these massacres did not contribute to a victory in the Korean War, and in fact have saddled the ROK government with a terrible issue that it's going to have to deal with for generations to come. There have been truth and reconciliation commissions in Korea that's trying to get, it's trying to find where the bodies are and trying to identify, who was killed, and in some ways close the chapter on this. But there's no closing the chapter on this kind of violence. And it's a very important thing to understand about the Korean War. It is the dirtiest of dirty wars. It's mass atrocities on both sides. It's violence right down to the granular level, and that's what the Bodo League massacre was. I hope that answered your question. Obviously, we have someone very knowledgeable about about the Korean War to get that sort of question.
Now, the next question. I will ask you right up front, I'm assuming that you do, but do you read Korean?
I do. And I speak Korean, although I've been studying Korean for 10 years. It is a frightfully difficult language to learn. So I will never tell people that I'm fluent in Korean. I don't think I'll be fluent my whole life. But yes, I've lived in Korea about 4.5 years.
The reason I ask is I have a question that I'm assuming is Korean, because I don't read or speak Korean, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. And if you can read it, and if you can't, I will ask the person to submit it in English if possible.
I can read it, but I think it will take me some time to fully digest the question. So I know, I think in the first part, they're actually saying that they really enjoyed it.
That's good.
And I think, and I think they're asking for my contact information, and yeah, I think that's what it is.
Okay.
So it's really less of a question, I think.
Okay. So if this individual, if you want to email me is it okay if I pass along your
Sure.
email address? If you contact me at tgudzinski@manitowoc.org, which I can actually scroll for you, just not to put myself in the spotlight, but there it is scrolling along the bottom there. If you email me at that address, I will pass along Professor Field's contact information to you. So thank you for translating, and thank you for asking for the contact information. And let's get back to the questions.
I should say I read Korean slowly, and so I read Korean text. It takes me about, I would say, 7 times as long to read a book in Korean as it does in English. So I still have plenty to learn.
Oh, fair enough. But just please contact me, and I'll pass along Professor Field's contact information. The next question is definitely much easier to answer in comparison to the last one. When were you in Korea, and what was your role there?
I've lived in Korea I've lived there several times, all totaled about 4 years. I got my start as an English teacher in rural Korea. I grew up in rural Wisconsin, actually. Graduated from college very much in debt and could not find a job. And I learned that I could go to Korea and become an English teacher. And that was appealing to me at that time because I needed the money, not because I had any interest in Korea at all. Matter of fact, I would have had a hard time locating Korea on the map before I found out about this opportunity. So I went there first as an English teacher, lived in rural Korea for 2 years, and over the period got very much interested in it, and then came back to the University of Wisconsin, did my graduate school. And then I've been back there several times, but always as a scholar. So I've been back as as what's called a FLAS scholar for the Department of Education, a critical language. I had a critical language scholarship, several of them from the Department of State. And then most recently, I was at Yonsei University as a Fulbright scholar. But I should say I've never worked in government. I've never had a government position. I've never been in the military. So all of my time in Korea has been either as a teacher or a scholar.
The next question is a two-part question. Does the U.S. have any other motives than protecting the ROK for maintaining troops in South Korea? And does North Korea, tied into the earlier question, have legitimate reasons to fear South Korea?
You know, this is a really, really important question, and I'm so glad that someone asked it, because protecting South Korea is part of the role of U.S. troops there, but I would argue that's not their primary role. And actually, the primary role of U.S. forces in Korea is the same as the primary role of U.S. forces in Japan and Okinawa, is to underwrite the stability of Northeast Asia. Okay, and that is something that is very much in the United States' interest to do. As I've alluded to in my talk, there are historical tensions between the U.S. and Korea. There's even deeper historical tensions between Korea and Japan, and between China and Japan. Many of these societies have fundamental issues with each other and do not trust each other at a fundamental level. But what happens is when you have 28,000 troops in Korea, when you have more American troops in Japan, it, in a sense, allows the Koreans and the Japanese to trust each other, okay? And in a large sense, it allows China to trade with Japan, okay? And to not really fear the Japanese. And so I really like to think of the United States' role in East Asia, not as defending anyone necessarily from anyone else, but allowing these societies to trust each other and to develop peaceful trading relationships with each other and with the United States. And as you know, Northeast Asia has been an engine for the global economy for the last 30 years and will continue to do so in the future. And the United States has benefited tremendously from this, okay? Americans have benefited tremendously from this. Now, as you know, there are costs to trade as well, okay? And the offshoring of jobs has been a definite cost, but there are advantages to this trade. Americans live materially richer lives because of our access to products that are made in China. So I like to think of the U.S. presence in Korea and in Japan as really underwriting American prosperity and underwriting American trade. They're not there primarily to defend South Korea. That's why they were sent. But over time, I think it's really become a deep relationship that serves American interests very well. And if I can just make one other point about this that I feel like often gets missed, and that is we've all I think most of us, I'm maybe a bit younger, but have grown up in an age where the United States is the dominant global power. And we think about our power in terms of our economic power, of our military capacity, of our ability to project power abroad. But one thing I feel like we often overlook is that central to this power that the United States has enjoyed is the presence of allies. All right. And without allies, I think the United States would just be actually a very large regional power instead of a global power. It's the American alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with Germany, all right, that allow the United States to project power all around the globe. All right, we could not do that alone. So I think these alliances are absolutely essential to the place in the world that the United States has enjoyed for so long, and also to the rules-based international order, which the United States, along with others, constructed in the post-World War II era. So in my opinion, U.S. troops are in Korea because it's in our interest for them to be there. They also protect the ROK, and that is an important part of their mission, but that's not the primary reason why we're there. And does North Korea have a legitimate reason to fear South Korea? If you're asking, will South Korea invade North Korea? I would say absolutely not. But do they have a reason to fear them in terms of South Korea being a much more successful society than North Korea is? Then I would say, yes, in that sense, they absolutely do. Okay. Because at some point, it's possible that North Koreans will recognize South Korean society and South Korea's political culture as an alternative to their own. And at that point, it will become very threatening to the North Korean regime. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near that point whatsoever. I think North Korea is a very stable society. But I think South Korea has no plans whatsoever to invade or do anything threatening to the North. But the very existence of South Korea is, in a sense, threatening to North Korea.
Next question is, if the Biden administration reaches out to North Korea, will this threaten our relationship with the ROK?
It depends on how they do it. But I would say at this point, no. In fact, I would say at this point, the Moon Jae-in administration would be delighted for the Biden administration to reach out to North Korea to pursue dialogue. And in fact, there were stories published over the weekend that the Biden administration is reaching out to North Korea behind closed doors. I have no insight into this more than anybody else. Anybody can leak anything. You don't necessarily know it's true, but that is what's being reported right now. I would say that would not threaten our relationship with the ROK at all. My personal perspective is, though, I would prefer that the Biden administration not do it. And I would prefer that the Biden administration, as much as possible, move the North Korean issue from a bilateral issue between the United States and North Korea and get back to a multilateral approach to North Korea. So the six-party talks that the Obama administration was pursuing. And the reason I prefer that strategy is quite simply, I don't think there's any solution to the North Korea problem. The problem is they want to have nuclear weapons and we don't want them to have them. And I don't think we can offer anything of value to them that's valuable enough to them to get them to give it up. All right. So I don't see any solution to this problem going forward. So when you have a problem that there's no solution to, I don't think you want to own it. I don't think you want this to be an issue of U.S.-North Korean relations. You want the entire international community, or at least all of North Korea's neighbors, involved on this. Because remember, North Korea's nuclear weapons, their nuclear weapons program was developed in opposition to the entire international community. And they're severely sanctioned by the UN right now, not just by the United States, for violating international agreements related to proliferation. Okay. And so I see really North Korea as an issue for the entire international community. And I think it would be a wise policy for the United States not to own this issue, not to attempt to solve this issue alone, to try to show a unified front of at least North Korea's neighbors and to show that you're not going to get anywhere on this issue. We can't stop you from doing this, but we can at least all be on the same side about this.
Do we have an ambassador to the ROK? Is the next question.
That is a really good question. And I mean, so Harry Harris was Donald Trump's ambassador. We did not have an ambassador to the ROK for a very long time. And I do not know if Harris has been recalled yet and a new ambassador has been appointed. I simply don't know. My sense is that Harris is still in place. And generally what the protocol is when a new president is appointed, they get to replace their ambassadorships. Now, Korea is sometimes an exception to this because Korea generally does not go to a political appointee. It's so sensitive that generally it goes to a career person in the State Department. That is not always the case, but often it's a career person. And what happened when Trump when Trump was elected is we had a very, very popular ambassador in Korea named Mark Lippert. And I actually had the privilege to meet him, and we attended the same church in Seoul. And he was wildly popular in Korean. And he was out there on the streets. He was learning Korean. He was always walking his dog. He was very popular and very accessible. And the Trump administration recalled him right away and then did not replace him for about 18 months. So for about 18 months, we had no ambassador in Korea. And then he was replaced by a retired Admiral Harry Harris, who by all accounts did quite a credible job. And I honestly cannot tell you right now if Harry Harris has been recalled or if he's still in Korea. I think he's still in Korea, probably while the Biden administration is vetting new ambassadors, and we'll be sending them along.
I have another question that's kind of a follow-up question to the first question, and that is, what is the status, if you know, of the new naval base on Jeju Island?
I have to say, if you're talking about an American naval base, I am not aware of an American naval base on Jeju Island. If there is one there, that would be news to me. There is a small American naval base in Jinhae, but the American presence in Korea is primarily the U.S. Army. There are some small, there is a small Marine camp there as well. And the large American naval bases are in Japan and in the Southwest Pacific. So if there's a base going into Jeju Island, I am unaware of it.
That's all the questions that we have thus far. We still have a little time for some more questions, if anyone has them. In order for you to get them into the comment box, just want to remind you, if you want the PowerPoint, please just email me at tgadzinski@manitowoc.org, and I will get you that PowerPoint presentation. Now seems like a good time to also remind you that our final week, next week, of Great Decisions for 2021 is on the topic of global supply chains and national security. The person giving that presentation is Professor Amelia Gertu of the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and that will be our final lecture for this year, our final virtual lecture. Hopefully, when next year rolls around, we will be meeting in the Balkanski room again. But, you know, these lectures have been great virtually, and it's been great connecting with you this way. There was just a quick commentary that I will show you, which I also happen to agree with. A very excellent presentation. And I believe that sums it up very nicely. I did have another question. If it looks like I'm not looking at you, it's just because the question was emailed to me, and I have to read it off of my email. So the question is, do you think that the breaking in at the North Korean embassy in Madrid during the train trip to Hanoi of Kim Jong-un to meet with Donald Trump, will that affect the outcome? Did that affect the outcome of the meeting?
No, I don't think it did. I think Trump went in there with the idea, you know, that it was going to be all or nothing. And when the North Koreans came with an incremental approach, that was the deal breaker right there. And Trump walked away. And I generally was not a fan of Donald Trump's approach to the North Korean issue, but I actually felt that walking away from the Hanoi summit was actually probably the right thing to do. That for better or worse, his fire and fury rhetoric had brought a lot of pressure to bear on North Korea. For a brief moment in time, the Chinese and the Russians were also placing pressure on North Korea by more strictly enforcing UN sanctions. I think he risked really surrendering a lot of that pressure and getting nothing in return. Now, I think through his own kind of inaction, actually, that moment passed and really wasn't fully exploited anyway. But I think the deal that was offered at Hanoi was not really a very good deal. And I don't really blame him for walking away from it. In fact, I think it was the right thing to do. As much as I really did not approve or really did not think that most of his policy towards North Korea was a good idea. I think his policy towards the South was an absolute disaster. Trying to monetize the U.S. relationship with Korea, you know, demanding a 400% increase in the SMA. I mean, it was poking the eye of an ally, a vital ally to the United States. And I just did not agree with that approach to U.S. foreign relations. I will say, just to follow up on a previous question, I did look it up real quick. And in fact, Harry Harris has left his post in Korea. I do not know if that means if he was recalled or if he just stepped down. A lot of ambassadors, when there's a change in administration, you know, they're being offered other opportunities. And so they might depart They might depart before their successor is fully appointed. So yes, in fact, as it stands right now, we do not have an ambassador in the ROK, but the embassy is being run by a charge d'affaires. So, but I assume that the Biden administration will be appointing one probably pretty quickly.
Not a question, but another quick comment. Thank you, Professor Fields, for such an informative session and on Wisconsin.
Wonderful.
And I think we will, unless I get a question in the next 30 seconds or so, I think we'll bring this to a close. Thank you very much, Professor Fields. I completely echo the sentiment that this was a fantastic lecture and very informative and just a lot of great information. It was wonderful having you. Thank you to everyone who joined us, either via Facebook or on YouTube. Great questions and comments. To the person who wrote in Korean, if you contact me at tkaczynski@manitowoc.org, I will pass along Professor Fields' contact information. And otherwise, please join us next week for the final week this year with global supply chains and national security. And we will see you next week. Thank you so much, Professor Fields, for being here tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a great night. Take care, everyone.